Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, now colleagues at the New York Times, have teamed up to deliver the most important look inside the Trump White House in the second term under the title Regime Change Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump. They conducted over 1,000 interviews for this book, with Donald Trump granting them an exclusive interview at the very last minute in March of this year as the book was headed to publication. The interview was on a Monday in March. And 3 days before welcoming them into the Oval Office, Donald Trump posted this on social media. Meghat Haberman, just another sleazebag writer for the failing New York Times, insists on writing false stories about me, even though she fully knows and understands that the exact opposite of anything she says is usually the truth. In any event, I'm thinking of adding Meghat and some of her associates into my Florida-based lawsuit against the Times, which very happily seems to be proceeding nicely. Thank you for your attention to this matter. And so, how were these two reporters greeted in the Oval Office just 3 days after Donald Trump spewed that vile poison at Maggie Haberman? Did he use that horrible nickname? Did he call her a sleazebag? No. Trump entered the Oval Office from the corridor connected to his private dining room. He was in smiling salesman mode. "Nice to see you," he said, gesturing for us all to sit down opposite him at the desk. It was the 17th day of his war with Iran. 13 American service members had already been killed, and more than 200 had been wounded. Thousands of Iranians were dead, including the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The Pentagon had already spent more than $15 billion, and the Strait of Hormuz was largely closed, sending global oil prices surging. The day before, Trump had made a demand for an international coalition of warships to secure the waterway, but few nations seemed interested in helping. This was hardly surprising. Trump had spent the previous year mocking NATO, bypassing the United Nations, and making clear that alliances were, in his view, either protection rackets or obstacles. The nations he was now calling on for help were the same ones he had bullied with tariffs, threatened with territorial claims, and cut out of major decisions like the one he had just made to wage war against Iran. As he greeted us, the war seemed the furthest thing from Trump's mind. On the Resolute desk, instead of a map of the Middle East, were printouts of maple trees. "I'm ordering trees for the White House," Trump told us. "I know how to buy good trees, maples." Trump held out another printout. The headline screamed 339 billion all-time views of Trump TikToks. "Can you believe it?" the president asked us. Then Trump showed us two final printouts, rendering from different angles of the grand ballroom he was building on the White House grounds. He was in a convivial mood. The structure would have 10 columns on one facade, he said, modeled on the Roman style, and the other side would be inspired by Athens. He noted with evident satisfaction that the columns were larger than those of the Supreme Court. Behind the scenes, some of his aides had told us they wished Trump was more anxious about the dangers he was courting and about his plunging poll numbers. The president's pollster, Tony Fabrizio, summarized findings from 2 nights of focus groups conducted earlier in March. The first fell on the very same day we sat looking at Trump's maple tree printouts in the Oval Office. The results were bracing. The war in Iran was unpopular, poorly understood, and seen as a broken campaign promise that was distracting the president from the economy and health care. The military action lacked a clear rationale, and voters saw negative economic consequences downstream of the conflict, compounding the affordability crisis that was already their top concern about the Trump presidency. Perhaps most distressing for the Trump team, the Epstein files came up consistently in focus groups and were a real negative with some of these voters. But Trump was uninterested in such feedback. To the extent he still cared about polling at all, he was seeing far fewer polls than during his first term. His advisors knew he was not receptive to being briefed on harsh realities. In his second term, unlike his first, he was willing to take breathtaking risks, risks that could throw not only his presidency, but the Republican Party and the entire world into chaos and carnage. More than ever before as president, he was operating on pure gut instinct. It would take a combination of mind reader and psychologist to explain fully why Trump was willing to gamble so much more recklessly now. There were obvious theories. He was term limited and no longer had to worry about re-election. He had immunity confirmed by the Supreme Court and no longer had to worry about prosecutions. He was more confident in his instincts. He had already served a presidential term and had felt vindicated so often. And there was the fact that he was a walking moral hazard, rarely saddled for long with the costs or consequences of his risk-taking and rule-breaking. Now was his moment to try things like military adventures and overthrowing the global trade system. Joining us now, New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning correspondent Maggie Haberman and her co-author, New York Times reporter Jonathan Swan, whose new book is Regime Change Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump. Maggie, I have to begin with you. And what is going on with you and Donald Trump? The world wonders about this because we've seen for years these vicious, and that last, I apologize for reading that one, but I had to set that stage for our audience. The viciousness of that, 3 days before you walk into the Oval Office. Did you already have the Oval Office appointment booked when he wrote that?
We did, and it was actually the first time that there had been one of those in some time. And thank you again for having us, Lawrence, and talking about the reporting for this book, which we really broke ourselves working on and are quite proud of. The only way that I can describe that action is a hip check, right, ahead of this interview. He was essentially trying to lay down a marker. Some people told us that people we had fact-checked different material with had gotten him spun up and in a heated mood about what he might get asked about. And so he was laying down a warning flag, and we've both been on the receiving end of attacks from him. He is, in my view, a subject I cover. We have spoken to him in the course of our daily reporting during news events and at either press conferences or on Air Force One or so forth. But we have actually spent very little time talking directly to him during this presidency, and that is a choice that we have made for a variety of reasons. But he has a specific fascination with the New York Times, and you know that. We've seen it over and over again. And I think just in his mind, he associates me with it. But for whatever reason, he never totally closes the door with anybody. And for our purposes, we had fact-checking questions we needed to ask him, and we needed to give him an opportunity to respond to, but we did not want it to be sort of open mic night in that kind of an interview where he was just going to pontificate. We asked a series of detailed questions, and he answered most of them.
So when you started at the New York Post, what was your first interaction with Donald Trump as a reporter?
Yeah, I've actually tried remembering my first one. I mean, the first clip that I have a byline on where he's quoted, I don't think it was me who spoke to him. I think there were three other names on the story, and it was after a Swissair plane crash. And he told whoever it was among us that had spoken to him that he had just gotten off the phone with one of the people who had been identified as having been killed in this crash. And I think it was a Swiss watchmaker or something. And he said that he was just about to start doing a product line with this person. I don't know whether that was true. It's obviously can't be verified. But he was in the ether. I was covering the rebuilding at the World Trade Center, and he did this plan about how he would unveiled something, how he was going to rebuild it exactly like it was. He did not own anything connected to the site, but he did want to be associated with it. When I started covering him most rigorously was in 2011, very end of 2010 and beginning of 2011, when he was looking at running for president. And that was the year that he started talking about birtherism in the middle of this proto-campaign or pseudo-campaign. And he watched his poll numbers take off. And the year later was the first time that he ever attacked me on Twitter. It's just what he does. So it's been a long, very similar ride, Lawrence. But I will tell you that I did a piece with Ben Smith when I was at Politico in 2011 about what Trump was doing and whether he was serious and whether he might run. And so much of that piece could have run at any point from 2011 until 2020. And one of the things that we talk about in this book is how much of this term has become the result of hubris, of his belief that he can get through any situation because he has before. But what you're seeing right now, particularly with Iran, is that he has a limited number of tricks, right? He has a limited number of tools in this kit. And it's coming up against reality and the limits of what he can bend it to.
Jonathan, where were you when you read that Truth Social thing on Friday about Maggie, and what did you feel when you were reading that?
He's done it so much that we were both expecting something. We knew something was going to come before the interview. There was no way. I mean, firstly,
Is it at the point where you laugh at this? Is there any sting in it when you read it? I mean, the words are so ugly.
He's been calling me maggot since my last book came out. I mean, literally, since actually I haven't published yet. And so it's been like half a dozen times or something like that. I mean, you get a flurry of texts of people saying, "Did you see this?" And yes, I saw it because I get alerts for.
And you get a lot of threats. You do. I mean, after I interviewed him in 2020, it was, an inundation. We don't talk about it publicly because you don't want to encourage people. But we've had to deal with that. There's no question about it.